Hello, everyone. In today's webinar, we have a very distinguished guest, Peter Rosset. As many of you know very well, he is a well-known activist as well as an academic. For long years, he has been working in the field of agroecology. He has made many valuable contributions in this field as a senior member of the field. Despite his very busy schedule, he was kind enough to accept our invitation to deliver a speech, a presentation today to you. So we would like to thank him for that. Just a technical reminder, this streaming will be in English. At the bottom right part of your screen, you have an icon called interpretation. So if you click on it, you will have options. And if you click on Turkish, you can follow the Turkish interpretation of this session. You can also ask your questions through the chat, merging the questions and asking them to our speaker. This is planned as a 1-hour event. We will have 30 minutes of a presentation by Peter, followed by your questions and comments. As you know, Peter has written extensively in the field of agroecology, and his works have been translated into many languages. And we have the Agroecology book that will be published soon, that he wrote together with Miguel Altieri.
It's a very, very great pleasure to have you here today. And we are really fortunate to be listening to you as someone who has contributed a lot on the political economy of the agroecology. So the floor is yours, and then after your discussion, I will be collecting comments and questions, and then we'll have a conversation through myself with the audience. So thank you once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fikret, and I thank you and the Istanbul Policy Center for the invitation, also Çiftli Sen for helping to arrange this connection. So it's a great honor to speak to public in Turkey and also in other countries who may be connecting. I will give a short presentation about agroecology. And in particular, I will take the example of La Via Campesina, the global peasant and small farmer movement, of which Çiftli Sen is a member, and to talk a little bit about the agroecology process and how that works. So I want to talk about how in social movements like La Via Campesina, we use farmer to farmer or peasant to peasant methodology, horizontal organization, horizontal pedagogy to scale up peasant agroecology. By scale up, I don't mean to make a small farm into a big farm, but what I mean is to have many small farms that all practice some form of ecological farming. But first, I think we need to look at the global dispute over rural areas, over the countryside. And I think one way to sum up this dispute is it's a dispute between global markets versus local needs. So there's a lot of pressure with capitalist restructuring that agriculture should become large and produce for export, and rural areas should not just be for agriculture, but should be for mining, for tourism, for infrastructure development. But all of that works against meeting local needs of local people. As you can see in some of the images here, where sometimes even the large export agriculture, monoculture, using poisonous chemicals need to be defended by riot police from the peasant and small farmer who have been driven off the land so that some large company can do that export production. A typical image from around the world. When we talk about addressing global markets versus local needs, we're talking about what kind of agriculture, but we're also talking about what kind of landscape. If we talk about primarily using rural area to address global markets, then we're talking about industrial food chain, which in the center you can see would be monoculture, and maintain very little biodiversity and very little cultural diversity. If we're talking about feeding people, meeting local needs, then we can do so much better through the peasant food web, which also local food system, which also implies a diverse landscape with more biodiversity and more local culture, more people. Contrary to what many people think, in fact, small farmers today feed the world with less than 1/4 of all farmland. These graphics sum up different studies, but in general, they all conclude the same, which is that small farmers have somewhere between 20%, 25% of global farmland. The majority of the land is in the hands of large landowners. Yet those small farmers and other small-scale food producers produce 70% of the food consumed by humanity today. In other words, the large corporate agriculture, even though it controls most of the land, produces only a small amount, a relatively small amount of the food. So we have a myth or a lie that corporate agriculture is very productive. In fact, it's not productive. In fact, it's peasant agriculture that's productive. I can take an example from a large agro-export country, which is Brazil, where we can see from agricultural census of the Brazilian government that peasants have only 24% of the land, and they only receive 14% of the credit and financing for production. Yet they produce 70% of all of the food and 74% of all of the employment. In contrast, agribusiness has 76% of the land, receives 86% of all of the finance and credit, but only produces 30% of the food. So in fact, there's a lot of confusion in the dominant policy discourse about how efficient and productive agribusiness is. In fact, it's peasant and family farm agriculture that can more efficiently feed more people with less land and less credit. Imagine if they had more land and more credit, how much could be produced? These images, probably these graphs are too small to see well, but I want to at least show the conclusion, and this is from real data. Small farms around the world produce more per hectare than large farms. This is because large farm is monoculture. Monoculture produces only one thing on each hectare, whereas small farms are diverse and produce many things on each hectare. The graph on the right, on the top, shows that this very high input in terms of fertilizer, chemical machinery, high input industrial agriculture, what we call the green revolution, can lift production at the beginning, but it cannot sustain high production level because it causes erosion of the soil, it causes the soil to lose fertility, and over time becomes less productive. And the graph on the bottom shows that the more agroecological, and I will explain in a minute what more agroecological means, but the more agroecological a farm is, the more it produces. So smaller farms produce more, more agroecological farms produce more. And even when the industrial agriculture is productive in the beginning, it loses that productivity over time. It is not sustainable. Now, that's the context. Now we come to La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina is the world's largest non-religious social movement. So we could say that after Christianity and Islam, La Via Campesina is the largest movement on planet Earth, because La Via Campesina brings together more or less 200 million families from rural areas in all continents of the world, from Asia, Africa, America, Europe, Middle East. La Via Campesina is present in 80 countries around the world, and it's a movement of small farmer and peasant organizations to defend life in the countryside. What these images show on the top is part of the work of La Via Campesina is political struggle, and on the bottom, part of the work of La Via Campesina is to transform production to become more ecological, more sustainable, and to offer better life for rural people and better food for city people. La Via Campesina, as I said, is in all continents, all parts of the world. It's a massive movement. And the main banner or flag of struggle of La Via Campesina is food sovereignty. And we often hear food security amongst policymakers, and food security is the dominant paradigm for policy. And on one hand, maybe says a good thing, which is everybody should have enough food, but food security is a very weak paradigm because it doesn't say anything about how the food is produced, where the food is produced, or by whom it is produced. So La Via Campesina criticized the food security paradigm because under the food security paradigm, the European Union or the government of Turkey should say, it doesn't matter if the food is produced in Turkey or in the United States or in Brazil. Only thing that's important is how cheap it is. And La Via Campesina respond with the food sovereignty paradigm saying it does matter. It's not the same food that is produced ecologically as food that is produced with poison and GMOs. It's not the same food that's produced in the same country or the same region as food produced halfway around the world. And it's not the same food produced by a peasant family as food produced by a giant corporation. So La Via Campesina says all of these things are important, and that's why we need to struggle for food sovereignty instead of just food security. And within food sovereignty, La Via Campesina says agroecology is a key pillar to construct food sovereignty. Now, in the view of La Via Campesina, peasant and family farm agroecology has many advantages compared to industrial agriculture. It produces healthy food for local people, this food sovereignty. It strengthens rural livelihood and rural culture. It is much more resilient to climate change and other shocks than industrial agriculture. It contributes less to greenhouse gas emission. For farmer families, it has lower production costs, means less debt for farmers. It means better management of productive resources and biodiversity, like soil, like forest. And for the farmer family, it means greater autonomy and less external dependence on market forces. So from the point of view of the global peasant and family farmer movement, agroecology is much superior to industrial agriculture. Now, where does agroecology or ecological farming come from? First of all, it comes from the knowledge and practices of small peasant farmers accumulated over thousands of years around the world. Long before we had chemical pesticide, long before we had chemical fertilizer, long before we had tractors, peasant farmers knew how to produce food. More recently, we can say that we have a dialogue among the different kinds of knowledge. For example, peasant and farmer knowledge and academic knowledge, ecology, agronomy, sociology, anthropology, economics. And from that, we can say we have created a science of agroecology, but that science originally comes from farmer knowledge. And nature is the model for agroecological farming. Industrial agriculture tries to farm against nature, tries to dominate nature, ends up destroying nature. Whereas agroecological farming farms with nature, together with nature, uses nature to help us, and we take care of nature. Now, I started by talking about knowledge. And this is the central thing if we talk about agroecology is knowledge. So industrial agriculture may be intensive in using money and using chemicals and using machines. Peasant agriculture is intensive in using knowledge. Now, city people have a lot of misconception, a lot of prejudice about peasants. They may see this picture of a peasant man and they may think this is an ignorant, uneducated person who has very little knowledge. This is the first thing many city people will think. But in fact, a peasant farmer, while preparing the land, is managing and integrating many complex and very sophisticated forms of knowledge. Knowledge about climatic phenomenon, knowledge about ecological interactions, knowledge about animals, about plants, about soil, about technology, about products, about markets, about weather. So the city person thinks here's an ignorant person, but in fact, I think no city person could successfully manage and integrate all of the complex knowledge that a peasant farmer utilizes every day. Principal characteristic of agroecology is that it applies principles and not recipes. You cannot, with industrial agriculture, we can say apply the same chemical fertilizer everywhere. With agroecology, the practices will be different depending on each unique local reality. And so this requires activating farmer knowledge and creativity. To do agroecological farming, we need this knowledge capability that farmers have. For industrial agriculture, we don't need it, but for agroecology, we do. So we need farmers thinking, using their knowledge and using their creativity. And if we talk about agroecology, I said it depends on principles. So for example, to recycle biomass, that can be done in different ways in different places. To always secure favorable soil conditions, good soil biology, good organic matter in the soil, minimize the loss of resources, have a more closed system, have a high level of diversification. We depend on biological interaction and synergism rather than input. So for example, instead of chemical poison to kill insect pests, we will plant a different combination of plants together that will chase the insect pest away, that will repel the insect pest. So we use an interaction instead of buying a poison. And agroecology depends on social organization and process. And that's something I want to talk about in the last part of my talk. And it particularly comes into play if we look at the major challenge. I think scientifically, it's proven that agroecological farming is superior to industrial farming. But we have the challenge. The industrial farming model is still dominant. How do we bring peasant and family farm agroecology to scale such that it is practiced by ever more families over ever larger territories? And that depends not just on the technical principles, but on social organization and social process. Social organization is the culture medium on which agroecology can grow and spread. If we want to spread agroecology, we have to construct horizontal social processes that use methodology that depend on social organization. So therefore, the global agroecology process in La Via Campesina is based on horizontal exchanges and includes more than 40 peasant and farmer agroecology schools where peasants teach peasants and farmers teach farmers. I have not that much time left, but I want to give very quickly a couple of big success stories inside La Via Campesina. One is in India, zero budget natural farming. India has a very severe crisis of farmers being in debt because of the high cost of industrial agriculture. So much debt that they lose their land, and such a bad land loss that many Indian farmers commit suicide. Official statistics say 300,000 farmers kill themselves in India because they lose their land to debt. As a response to that, we have a zero budget movement, meaning we don't spend any money, we use only our own resources. We use natural farming or agroecology instead of buying fertilizer, buying seeds, buying chemicals. And so these are just some pictures from this very successful movement. By some estimates, more than 20 million peasant farmers in India have changed how they farm and now produce more than before, even though they're no longer spending money for inputs. The biggest success story in the world of peasant agroecology in terms of absolute numbers. And La Via Campesina works to spread this movement through horizontal farmer-to-farmer exchanges. Farmers visit the experience, are inspired by it, learn from it, and take lessons from it to build agroecology processes in their own province, in their own country. Remember that I was talking about knowledge. The Green Revolution imposed an external knowledge that came from agriculture universities, knowledge about how to do monoculture, about how to produce export, about how to use machines, and was imposed on peasants by know-it-all agronomists who crush the initiative, the protagonism, the knowledge, and the practices of peasants, who by imposition, by colonization, destroy the diverse peasant landscape and replace it with the monoculture landscape. But now it's the imposition of knowledge that made peasants no longer believe in their own knowledge. That is the key to the Green Revolution imposition. We have a second big success story in La Via Campesina in Cuba, which is based on what is called the campesino de campesino. That means peasant to peasant in Spanish. The campesino de campesino, or peasant to peasant methodology, which is a horizontal exchange of knowledge. This photo is a Cuban peasant farmer explaining to a group of other farmers from his community how he does his agroecological farming. So instead of a top-down imposition of knowledge, it's a horizontal exchange of knowledge. In this methodology, there's a key teaching or pedagogical moment, which is when a peasant family who has an agroecological solution to a problem that many other peasant families have, offer a workshop on their own farm to other peasants and teach them the solution. So in this methodology, peasants are the teachers and their farm is their classroom. So here we have a peasant using his farm as a classroom to teach other peasants. This is organized in a highly organized way by the peasant organization, who in each community and each territory carries out an inventory of all of the agroecological practices of the different families. They will see which family does crop rotation, which family has intercropping, which family use botanical pest control, all the different practices in order to determine which families can teach the solutions to other families. And then the same peasant organization does an inventory of the problems. So which family has which problem, and then they will invite the family with one problem to the workshop offered by the family that has the solution to their problem. So it's an organized process of horizontal exchange of knowledge in order to resolve real problems and overcome real problems. And this has been very successful to achieve agroecological transition. In Cuba, 50% of all farmers in the country became agroecological in 25 years with this methodology. So the two biggest success stories are India and Cuba, and they both illustrate the principle of peasant organization, peasant movement, systematically creating a process of horizontal exchange. And I just have a couple of minutes. I want to show photos of some of our peasant agroecology schools of La Via Campesina around the world, where peasants teach peasants and where young peasants are trained to be able to organize these kind of processes at the territorial level. They will become facilitators and builders of these processes. So this is a peasant agroecology school of La Via Campesina in Paraguay. This is peasant agroecology school in Argentina. Peasant agroecology school in Ecuador. Peasant agroecology school in Indonesia. In India. In Quebec, Canada, because Via Campesina is in both northern and southern countries. And just to sum up, and this is really the last thing I want to say, in order to bring to scale, multiply this peasant agroecology, what we have found in La Via Campesina is we need social organization and social movements. We need these kind of horizontal social process methodology and pedagogy, like the campesino to campesino or peasant to peasant method. We need peasant leadership or protagonism in the processes. We need ecological farming practices that work well. We need to have a motivating discourse and framing. So, for example, if Chifti Sen want their members to become agroecological, Chifti Sen need to have a discourse that will motivate them to make the change. There should be political opportunities, external allies, sometimes academic, sometimes NGO, sometimes religious institution. Often charismatic leaders are important in the initial transition. It's good to have favorable markets. If peasant product get a good price, if ecological product give a good price, that helps the process. And of course, it's good to have favorable public policies, although most governments in the world are so bad that we cannot count on favorable public policies. We need to build the process ourselves in the peasant and farmer movement. So I finish with the slogan of La Via Campesina, which is globalize the struggle, globalize hope, and I think I could add globalize peasant agroecology. So I think that's my half-hour presentation, and now we can go into question and discussion. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for this very informative and at the same time very concise presentation. Very well done. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. Let me get over them. Well, to start, I would like to ask mine first. Let's consider the issue of waste in the agricultural sector and in the food industry. We know, roughly speaking, 1/3 of food is being, wasted somehow, somewhere. In terms of agroecology versus agribusiness, can we say anything about the sort of the percentage of waste that is being produced? Perhaps that will be yet another reason why we should be relying on agroecology.
Yes, well, I think first of all, part of the waste comes from capitalism, because a lot of food is produced, but not all of it is bought, because food is only given to people who can pay for it. So even though we have probably twice as much food as humanity needs being produced every year, we still have a big part of humanity that is hungry because of the capitalist system. That means they don't have money to buy the food that is available, and they don't have land to produce for themselves. So part of that problem with waste is a problem of capitalism. But of course, the industrial food system is also wasteful in and of itself. For example, they may be only taking fruit or vegetable with a particular cosmetic characteristic and throwing away the rest. Or they may only use one small part of the plant and forget about the rest. Whereas an agroecological and diverse system will probably do a lot more recycling and a lot more use of all of those products, and therefore will have a lot less waste. Or if there's waste, the waste will be recycled into the system as compost, as mulch, as other forms of use. And also, along with the peasant agroecology and the agroecological diversification, also is a simultaneous and compatible process to promote a lot more artisanal production of processed food by peasant organization and peasant co-op. So for example, if the co-op is producing fresh fruit, but not all the fruit is beautiful looking, then the non-beautiful fruit will go into the cooperative processing plant to make juice, to make marmalade, to make many other products. So instead of being wasted, like if it was an industrial company, maybe they just throw it away. But if it's a peasant co-op, then we can have many different ways to use all of the different products. So I think it's both capitalism, but also agroecology, and these peasant processes a good way to address the waste issue.
Well, thank you. One question is about the possibility or the potentiality of using clever technology, digital technology in agroecology. Are we in favor or against the use of technology? That's perhaps, let me sort of put a couple of questions together. And the second, this was by Doğacan. The second question I would like to formulate is put forward by Tolga. What about the effects of pandemics on the agroecology in general? So perhaps let's go over these two questions quickly.
Okay.
And then I have a couple more coming up, and so let's try to be as concise as possible.
I think that the digital technology is a double-edged sword, and that the corporate agriculture view of digital technology, which is called Agriculture 4.0,
yes,
is the integration of data companies like Microsoft and Amazon with seed companies and agricultural chemical companies like Bayer Monsanto, Syngenta, and agriculture machinery companies like John Deere to completely push the domination of the industrial model even further and displace the peasant model even more. So that agriculture 4.0 is not compatible with agroecology, is not compatible with peasants or even human farmers. On the other hand, our agroecology processes take a lot of advantage of some of the new digital technologies and social networks. So for example, the zero budget natural farming movement in India. India has very good cell phone connectivity in rural areas. And so we find that many peasant farmers create their own Instagram groups, their own WhatsApp groups, their own TikTok videos, and they are teaching each other how they make bokashi, liquid fertilizer, how they make compost, how they integrate, how they intercrop, how they use alternative food for their cow. So it can accelerate some of these farmer-to-farmer agroecology and training processes. So I guess in the end, it depends on who controls the technology or who's using the technology. If it's the peasant movement, yes, we can move forward many times very quickly with digital technology. But if it's Microsoft in an alliance with Monsanto and John Deere, then it's a step towards a worse step towards the domination of the industrial model. So I could say it's a territory in dispute, just like the countryside. The digital terrain is also in dispute. Now, with the pandemic, I think we have a very teachable moment, a pedagogical moment that all of the peasant movement, all of the alternative food movement, all of the environmental movement need to take advantage of this moment to push forward the agenda of food sovereignty and agroecology, because agribusiness is the explanation of why the pandemic. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but in the scientific literature of epidemiology, there are only 3 major possible explanations for the origin of SARS-CoV, and all of them are related to agribusiness. At the same time, the pandemic showed the weakness of the long supply chains of agribusiness, and many times lockdowns prevented transport, and supermarkets did not have products, and people went back to the local food system, to the peasant market, in order to get food. Yesterday, I just interviewed a lady from Colombia. She's in a local peasant association, and she said before the pandemic, they could not sell anything in the local market, in the local city, because everything come in trucks very cheap. The pandemic caused lockdown in the whole province. No trucks come, no food in the supermarket. The peasant organization went, invade a park in the city, put all of their products and sell everything in 2 hours. And now they're going to start doing it like every 3 days, because they discovered this huge market because of the pandemic. And also we see that many of the comorbidity factors are related to bad food. People who die from COVID, it's because they are obese, or because they have diabetes, or because they're malnourished, or because they have heart disease, or because they have cancer possibly caused by pesticide in their food. So healthy food also can be seen to be more important as a result of the pandemic. So for all of the reasons, agribusiness caused the pandemic, agribusiness caused the bad food that make us die from the pandemic, agribusiness can't feed us during the pandemic. So it's all arguments for peasant, ecological, healthy food, local food production. But we, as the movements, have to be able to take advantage of that and make the argument to society. We have the moment, we need to take advantage of the moment.
Well, perhaps a related question by Kıvanç is how would you evaluate the position of organic markets that we keep observing in cities in Turkey and in other countries as well? Could this be seen as a kind of facilitator for the agroecology or else?
I think it's similar to the digital technology. It can cut both ways. The problem is that corporate organic, it takes away market share from peasant production, but peasants also can produce high quality organic food using agroecology. So the interest in organic intensifies maybe the dispute. It creates both opportunity but risk, because, for example, in the United States, the organic food market, the place in the overall food economy for organic, that was created by pioneering organic family farmers, but then was appropriated by organic agribusiness, who then drove the original farmers out of the market. So the problem is, as long as it's controlled by the monopoly supermarket chain and agribusiness, that whether it's organic or conventional, it's going to exclude family farmers. So we need to insist on some other kind of definitions other than just organic, because organic just means no chemical was used. It doesn't mean whether it's produced by a big farmer, small farmer, whether it had good labor relations, bad labor relations, whether the benefit was shared or not shared, or so it's not enough organic, and it's an area of dispute.
Well, let's keep going on the political economy side. Well, the first question is, how would you evaluate the position of FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, sort of an overview of their position vis-a-vis agroecology? Yeah. And then another, this was put forward by Ayşegül, another question by Matt Khan. Well, okay, that's all fine, but I mean, currently strong business is the dominant one, and therefore, you know, there is a power asymmetry between small peasantry and you know, big agribusiness. So how are we going to sort of face with that reality? And perhaps you may want to put a bridge between FAO and the current reality, and perhaps you may want to say a few lines with regards to the future path.
Well, I think that we have a global war, literally a war between capital and people and nature in rural areas. On the one side, we have expressions of capital like agribusiness, like mining, like large-scale infrastructure development corporations. And on the other hand, we have peasant and family farmers, and we also have their allies in the city, like consumers who want healthy food or who have low income. And so this war plays itself out in many different battlefields. And one of the battlefields is FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, where it's in theory a democratic forum, for example, compared to the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization does not have equal voting rights for different countries, but in theory, the United Nations system does, although we know most of the governments who are voting in FAO are already sold out to private sector interests. But at least in theory, it could be democratic. And so La Via Campesina doesn't believe we're going to solve the world's food problems by being present in debates that occur in the context of FAO, but does believe that that it is still an important forum where we should be fighting. It's a battlefield, because what is official FAO policy then has a big influence on decisions made by ministries of agriculture in countries around the world. So usually bad things will come down to the national level. Bad things will come from FAO because governments are deciding, and governments are beholden to the private sector. Then they vote in FAO, then something bad comes. But Via Campesina is a very big movement, and we able, together with allies of NGOs and other sectors, have been able to have a very strong voice and presence in FAO, and to limit some of the damage that comes from that level, and sometimes even open spaces for some alternative policy recommendations. And an example of this is the agroecology process in FAO since 2014, which before FAO wouldn't even talk about agroecology, but through a lot of pressure from social movement, began to talk about agroecology. I should say, though, to be honest, not just pressure from social movement, because also agribusiness realized that they need to use some agroecology technology to make their own model more sustainable. So they more or less also push for some opening, although they don't want the political content, just the technical part. In any event, FAO has now an agroecology process. And this is a battlefield where Via Campesina is present, fighting over the determination of policy. Out of that now is coming many policies at the national level for agroecology, but have to fight again, because when neoliberal governments create agroecology process, what they automatically want to do is give credit or finance to agribusiness companies so that they can become more green. They don't want to give credit and finance to peasant organizations so that they can win back market share from agribusiness. So the peasant movement has to fight at every point, fight at the FAO level, fight at the national level, fight at the local level, and build our own alternatives autonomously from all of those other levels. Because Via Campesina is very big, it's possible to be doing all of that work at the same time, because maybe we have our Italian member organization has an office in Rome, can be screaming at FAO at the same time that Çiftçi Sen is screaming in Ankara or whatever, and the MST is screaming in Brasilia. So we can be in many places at the same time because we're a very big movement. But to answer the question about the global power imbalance, absolutely, it's an unequal war. It's a war for life and death. So we cannot not fight the war. But yes, it's very unequal. The power relations are completely asymmetric. And the only thing that people's movements have is the ability to do mobilization. And so we have to use our capacity and strengthen our capacity for mobilization, because the other side has money, which is a very powerful tool, and also repression. We only have mobilization and our ability to also influence public opinion, dispute public opinion. And that's why this moment with the pandemic is very important. So it's unequal, it's a difficult battle, a difficult war, but we cannot not fight it.
Okay, so let me have what I think quick questions, 3 quick questions, and then I'll have a very big one. So let's have first the short ones. Arzu has asked whether La Via Campesina is planning to attend the UN Food Systems Summit. That's question 1. Question 2 by Gökçe. What about the climate crisis? You mentioned this, that the agroecology is much resilient, but you may elaborate this point a bit. And then Burçin has asked whether growth paradigm is something that is against the agroecology, or whether that's something that can go together, because there is also arguments that a growing economy will bring about an increased ecological footprint, which will affect directly or indirectly the rural areas, and so therefore, do we think that we should at the same time be challenging the growth paradigm? So why don't we go over these 3 questions, and then, as I said, a big one is about to come.
So on the first question on the UN Food System Summit, I should say I recently retired from the Secretariat of Via Campesina, so I cannot answer 100%, but as far as I know, Via Campesina, along with most other civil society organizations, along with many scientists and scientific societies around the world, are boycotting the summit, because the summit has been totally turned over to private sector interests and is not giving any kind of respect to hearing voices from civil society. And so as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, the last I knew, Via Campesina, together with most of civil society, is boycotting and will be doing alternative forums to debate the same issues, but not accept to be in the official forum, because the conditions for participation were really insulting to civil society. On the climate crisis, I think it's also a teachable moment for agroecology and food sovereignty, just like the pandemic, because agribusiness and other and extractive industries are also major causes of greenhouse gas emission. Relocalizing the food system through food sovereignty and reducing emission through agroecology are real solutions. But unfortunately, governments are dedicating themselves with the private sector to false solutions like agrofuels or biofuels, carbon credits and all of this. So it's another arena of dispute. And on the growth paradigm, sometimes I think too much emphasis is placed on whether we're looking for economic growth or degrowth, because it more depends on the quality and composition of the growth. I'm more concerned about peasant incomes growing and the urban poor incomes growing than I care much about whether average income grows or degrows. I would certainly be happy for rich people in the private sector to have degrowth, but I want growth for poor people and peasants, and economic growth for peasants can come through transforming our food system to an agroecological and food sovereignty system. And that makes more food also available and more healthy food for poor people in an urban setting. So I personally have not been felt very moved by the degrowth debate at an overall level. I'm more concerned about who's getting ahead and who's falling behind, rather than the overall total. I mean, gross domestic product, for example, is a totally meaningless statistic if we don't talk about what the actual composition is, both ecologically and socially.
Well, thank you. And perhaps I may add just one line to the last point. As someone who is working on the degrowth sort of paradigm here, we should also be thinking about, which sector, needs growing and which sector needs, scaling down. Well, I mean, with the pandemic, for example, in Europe, we have observed that the caring sector it needs an enlargement. I mean, it has been a sector that was neglected for over years. So for sure, I mean, in the coming years, we need to concentrate on the care system. Okay, so let's come to the big question. A couple of friends, Duygu, Bilge, Çiğdem, Arzu, Mertkan, all sort of focus on the issue that thinking on Turkey, there has been a claim that we need to scale up because of the scale economy, and we need to consolidate, small farmers, and that has been a policy together with mechanization and high-tech utilization more, and of course we need to also remember the impacts of the neoliberal policies after 2000s. More and more people left the rural side and found themselves in villages and in cities. And another development, I think that is not unique to Turkey, and that's something that Peter and I have been, talking on before the webinar, is the increased number of what I call part-time peasants. I mean, I have a job in a village, and in the same time, I have a bit of piece of land, and then, I am half-time peasant, half-time whatever I do. But at the end of the day, the population in the rural areas, has been getting down. So if we are talking about agroecology, as Peter, you mentioned, this is a labor-intensive sort of technique. So what are we expecting? Are we expecting a repopulation in the rural sites, or what? And what needs to be done at that point in terms of the population, in terms of labor? And well, perhaps that will be our last sort
yes.
of question. We are getting out of time. So this is a big question.
There are many answers to many parts of that question, and I probably only have time to mention a few of them. But For example, agroecology can be very labor intensive, but it can also be labor saving, because agroecology is a series of principles that can be applied, can be materialized in a different way in different realities. So for example, peasant agroecology in very densely populated rural areas, like in some parts of Asia, uses very manual labor intensive practices. But agroecology in low population density areas, like many places in Latin America, apply the same principle of, for example, ecological control of pests, but do it in a labor-saving way. For example, spraying a botanical pesticide instead of manual control of pests. And so agroecology itself is very flexible in terms of how labor-intensive versus labor-saving. Of course, on the average, it's going to be more labor-intensive than industrial agriculture, but it doesn't have to be dramatically labor intensive. That really depends, and different local society and economy will have a need for more labor intensive or less labor intensive ways of implementing agroecological principles. So that's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is probably we have a population imbalance, and probably if we had agrarian reform and the opportunity to access land and a good market for farm products, some people who currently live in cities would prefer to live in the countryside. And I'm referring to many people in the rural poor who are essentially from peasant families. They migrated to the city, they live in urban slum, they never found good job, they never found good housing, they never found good life for their children, they live under domination by criminal gangs. They don't like their life, and if there were land reform, there could be a net readjustment in many countries between rural dwellers and urban dwellers. The last thing that I would like to say is that we have perhaps an illusion now that most of the world's population is completely urban, because from a Via Campesina point of view, the global peasant movement point of view, I would like to make the radical provocation that the majority of the world's population is still peasant. And let me say why. I know on a global census level, for the first time in the history of humanity, less than 50% of the world of humanity are peasants, and more than 50%, I think like 52% or something now of humanity live in cities. In all of human history before, it was always 80, 90% were peasants. So it appears that we have a real change where being a peasant is no longer the dominant form of life, way of life for humanity. However, what has happened over the last 80 years with industrial agriculture and the Green Revolution has been a mass exodus of people from rural areas to cities. As I pointed out, they were expelled by machinery, mechanization, consolidation. They were expelled from the countryside. Mostly they went to live in urban slums, in the urban periphery, in favelas, as one would say in Brazil. And so the biggest growth of humanity demographically over the last 80 years, and especially the last 30 years, has been urban slums. So if we add together about the 48% of the human population that are still peasants and the 30% who live in urban slums, we can say that's maybe 80% of the world's population. Who are living in urban slums around the world? I would say that my characterization is they are either peasants who migrated from the countryside, sons and daughters of peasants, or grandsons and granddaughters of peasants. And if you look at the culture of people in the urban slum, it's still peasant culture. They grow herbs in the window. If they have a backyard, they raise animals. They have backyard garden. If they have room for a fruit tree, they have a fruit tree. If they can have a goat, they have a goat. If they can have chickens, they have chickens. So it's really still a peasant culture in the city. They also, urban agriculture is growing very fast around the world. And sometimes we have a mischaracterization of urban agriculture as being urban middle class activity. But in fact, numerically, the majority of urban agriculture is in urban slums. It's just doesn't come out on television programs as the beautiful urban garden. It's backyard production. And most of the people in urban slums still have extended family in the countryside. They go back and forth. They bring products from their family, they sell them in the neighborhood. They grow products, they prepare, they make products, they sell them. They supply traditional foods in many cities around the world through street vendors. So in my opinion, we have the majority of humanity are peasants. Part of them are peasants in the countryside, part of them are peasants in the city. And they're both part of the same family, the same big peasant family and literally the same extended family. So this tells me that we have a potential political alliance, not a current political alliance, because unfortunately, the urban brothers and sisters of peasants are often confused by fundamentalist religions, by politicians, by criminal gangs. But at least there is a family and cultural tie. And I think one task for the peasant movement right now is to take that potential alliance and try to do political work with the peasant brothers and sisters in the city and try to build a movement that it would be based on an alliance between the urban poor, who are peasants, and the rural poor, who are peasants, and therefore have a potential political majority in most countries of the world. So I think that's probably my last contribution, and I hope that's provocative enough to leave people thinking.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, we have lots of food for thought. And Peter, I think we ran out of time, and I would like to thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and also very thoughtful answers and comments. And I would like also thank to our attendees who put forward very interesting and very nice questions and came up with very thoughtful comments. Well, I'm afraid we have to cut the program here. I wish we could have more time to discuss, and I'm sorry for those attendees whose questions I couldn't forward to you. But what I'll do is I have sent my email, so if anyone has any questions, please email to me, and then I'll try to do my best. And I would like to also address to Peter if necessary. So, Peter, thank you very much, and have a very nice day and healthy day as well. And let me finish in Turkish.
Okay, let me just say thank you, Fikret.
Okay.
Thank you to IPC, thank you to Çifti Sen, thank you to the interpreters, and thank you to the public. It's been very stimulating for me to hear the different questions and comments. So thank you so much.
Ben de hepinize çok teşekkür ederim.
I also would like to thank all of you. Peter has already mentioned that. I would like to thank the interpreters also and our assistants at IPC. Thank you. It's been a very successful and fruitful meeting. Hopefully, we will meet you in the upcoming webinars. Thank you and see you around.